I live in a high-rise apartment in the city, a place of polished steel and sprawling views that I earned through relentless 60-hour workweeks at a top law firm. My life is a carefully constructed tower of ambition and discipline, built on the foundation of a simple promise I made to myself long ago, to give my family everything they never had. It turns out, they took that promise and twisted it into a weapon to use against me. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. The house was my masterpiece. It wasn't a mansion, but it was the kind of solid, respectable suburban home my parents, Mark and Susan, had always talked about in wistful tones when I was growing up. It was a 4-bedroom colonial with dark green shutters, a sprawling oak tree in the front yard, and a backyard big enough for the grandkids they hoped I'd one day provide. I bought it 3 years ago, the day after I made partner at my firm. The down payment alone was more than my father had ever made in a single year during his career as a salesman. I didn't think of it that way, of course. To me, it wasn't a transaction, it was a tribute. It was the physical manifestation of my love and gratitude. I never lived in that house. It was theirs. The mortgage was in my name, a fact I never mentioned. The bills, from the property taxes to the electricity, the water, the ridiculously expensive cable package my brother Jake insisted they needed, were all on auto pay, drawn directly from my account. I even set up a generous monthly stipend for their groceries and living expenses, an amount that was more than enough to cover their needs and leave plenty for leisure. I wanted them to be comfortable. I wanted them to be free from the financial anxiety that had haunted my childhood, the hushed arguments over bills that used to seep through my bedroom walls at night. I thought I was giving them peace. In reality, I was just funding their resentment. My relationship with them had always been transactional, though I was loath to admit it. Growing up, love was conditional. Good grades earned me a temporary smile from my father. Winning a debate tournament got me a rare, "That's my girl," from my mother. It was never about me, Clara, the person. It was about my achievements, the things I could do that reflected well on them. My younger brother, Jake, was the opposite. He was the charming, aimless dreamer who could do no wrong. His failed bands, his abandoned college courses, his string of short-lived jobs, they were all just part of his journey. My successes, on the other hand, were simply what was expected. They were my duty. This dynamic only intensified once I became their sole financial provider. My weekly calls home became a predictable routine. My mother, Susan, would answer with a sigh, as if my call was an interruption. "Oh, hello, Clara. Is everything all right?" she'd ask, her tone suggesting that the only reason I'd call was if there was a problem with one of the automatic payments. There never was. I'd ask about their week, and she'd give me a clipped summary of her library shifts and the latest neighborhood gossip before inevitably steering the conversation to a new, unforeseen expense. "The dishwasher is making a funny noise again, dear. Mark thinks we might need a new one," she'd say. "And Jake's car is in the shop. The mechanic said it's going to be a few $100s, at least." "No problem, Mom. Just send me the bill," I'd reply, my voice a well-practiced monotone. "Is Jake looking for work?" A pause. "It's a tough market for creatives, Clara. You wouldn't understand. He needs to protect his energy for his art." His art was a series of poorly produced electronic music tracks he'd upload to a streaming service where they'd get, on average, 12 plays, most of which were likely from my mother. My father, Mark, was usually more direct. He treated me less like a daughter and more like a subordinate who was failing to meet his unstated expectations. If I was a few minutes late for a family dinner, he'd tap his watch and say, "Nice of you to finally join us." Some of us still value punctuality. If I mentioned a tough case at work, he'd wave a dismissive hand. "That's what you get paid the big bucks for, right? Don't come complaining to us." The word they loved to use, the one that felt like a tiny, sharp jab every time, was freeloader. It was always directed at my brother, but the implication was always aimed at me. It started as a joke. At a family barbecue, Jake was lounging in a hammock while I was helping my mom clear the table. My uncle commented on how relaxed Jake looked. "Oh, that's Jake," my dad said with a loud, theatrical laugh. "He's our resident freeloader. Good thing he's got a sister who's willing to pay for his extended vacation." Everyone chuckled, and I forced a smile, feeling the familiar heat of embarrassment creep up my neck. I was paying for the hammock, the house, the food on the table, but somehow, I was the butt of the joke. Over time, the joke became a narrative. They started using it more frequently, especially when I was around. "Jake, you freeloader, pass the salt," my mother would say at the dinner table, followed by a pointed look in my direction. They were creating a fiction where Jake was the lovable rogue, a charming burden they tolerated with amusement, and I was the stern, distant provider who enabled it all. What I didn't realize was that this fiction was for public consumption. To my face, I was the bank. Behind my back, I was becoming something else entirely. The breaking point was set in motion by a simple invitation. My mother called me, her voice uncharacteristically bright. "Clara, we're having a small dinner party next Saturday. Just a few of the neighbors and your Aunt Carol. We're celebrating your father's retirement anniversary." "His what?" I asked, confused. My father had been forced into early retirement 5 years ago after his company downsized. It had been a bitter pill for him to swallow, not something to celebrate. "Well, you know. He's been retired for 5 years now. It's a milestone," she said, her voice strained. "We just want to have a nice evening. Can you be here around 7? And dear, could you pick up a nice case of that red wine Mark likes? The imported one." "Of course, Mom," I said, already making a mental note to transfer extra funds for the party groceries. "I'll be there." I should have seen the red flags. The forced cheerfulness in my mother's voice. The absurdity of celebrating a painful memory. But I was trapped in my role, the dutiful daughter. I believed that if I just kept giving, just kept providing, one day they would finally see me. They would finally appreciate the sacrifices I'd made. I thought I was building them a life of comfort and security. I had no idea they were using the bricks I provided to build a wall between us, and on the other side of that wall, they were painting a portrait of me as a monster. The dinner party was meant to be its grand unveiling. I arrived at precisely 7:05 p.m., carrying a heavy case of the $1.80 bottle Cabernet Sauvignon my father adored and a meticulously wrapped gift for his anniversary, a high-end fishing rod he'd been admiring for months. I walked up the bluestone path I had chosen, to the front door I had paid for, and rang the doorbell that chimed a tune I'd selected from a catalog. My mother opened the door, her face a mask of social grace. "Clara, you're here," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. She took the case of wine without a word of thanks and gestured me inside. Everyone's in the living room. The house was filled with the low hum of conversation. The neighbors, the Hendersons and the Clarks, were there, along with my mother's sister, Aunt Carol. My father was holding court by the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand, laughing loudly at something Mr. Henderson said. Jake was slumped on the couch, scrolling through his phone, looking profoundly bored. He glanced up when I entered and gave me a lazy nod. "Hey, sis. Brought the good stuff, I see," he said, eyeing the wine. "Happy retirement anniversary, Dad," I said, handing the long, thin box to my father. He took it, his expression unreadable. "You didn't have to do this," he said, though his tone implied that, actually, I did. He unwrapped it with performative slowness, revealing the sleek graphite rod. "Ah. Very nice," he declared to the room. "At least some of the money she makes is put to good use." A few people laughed nervously. I felt that familiar sting, but I swallowed it down. This was my father. This was just how he was. I found a spot on the arm of a chair and tried to blend into the background, nursing a glass of sparkling water. The conversation flowed around me. They talked about property values, the upcoming local election, the Hendersons' recent trip to Florida. I was an island in the middle of it all. Whenever someone tried to engage me, my parents would deftly steer the conversation away. "Clara, how is work at the firm?" Mrs. Clark asked kindly. Before I could answer, my mother jumped in. "Oh, you know lawyers. Always busy, busy, busy. More wine, Eleanor?" She refilled Mrs. Clark's glass, and the moment passed. The passive-aggressive jabs continued throughout dinner. The pot roast, which my mother made sure to announce she'd spent all day preparing, was the centerpiece. When I complimented her on it, she said, "Well, it's easy to find the time when you don't have a demanding career to worry about." My father chimed in, "Some of us have to work for a living, Susan. Others just sign the checks." He winked at Mr. Henderson, who looked deeply uncomfortable. The true betrayal, however, wasn't delivered to my face. It was a dagger slipped between my ribs when I wasn't looking. After dinner, I was in the kitchen helping my aunt clear the plates. I'd scraped the leftovers into a container and was rinsing the dishes when I realized I'd left my phone in the living room. I dried my hands and walked quietly down the hallway. The living room was empty, but I could hear voices coming from the back porch, the sliding glass door left slightly ajar. It was my mother, Aunt Carol, and Mrs. Henderson. I stopped, not wanting to interrupt, but then I heard my name. "I just don't know how she does it, Carol," my mother was saying, her voice a pitch of theatrical woe. "What do you mean, Susan?" my aunt asked. "Living here. With us." At her age, my mother said with a heavy sigh. "It's a lot. We love her, of course, but the financial strain is becoming unbearable. Mark and I are on a fixed income. We thought our retirement would be our time, you know? But having to support a grown daughter, it's not what we planned." I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The blood drained from my face. It felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. Was this some kind of bizarre joke? Mrs. Henderson, bless her heart, sounded confused. Support Clara? But I thought she was a partner at that big law firm downtown. Don't they make a lot of money? My mother let out a short, bitter laugh. "Oh, that's the story she tells everyone. It's all about appearances with Clara. The fancy clothes, the expensive apartment. It's all on credit. She's drowning in debt. We're the ones who have to bail her out, month after month. This house," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "is a constant worry. The mortgage, the taxes, it's all on us. We've had to dip into our savings more times than I can count. Mark is so stressed he can't sleep." Aunt Carol, ever the loyal sister, clucked her tongue in sympathy. "Oh, Susie, that's awful. I had no idea. She seems so put together." "That's Clara for you," my mother said, the final, venomous twist of the knife. "She's a freeloader, Carol. A professional one. She lets us handle all the real responsibilities while she plays the part of a successful lawyer. Honestly, some days I think she does it just to humiliate us." I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt like they were filled with cement. I backed away from the door, my movements silent and robotic. I stumbled back into the kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might break through. I leaned against the counter, the cold granite a stark contrast to the fire raging inside me. Freeloader. The word echoed in my mind. The casual, joking insult they'd thrown around for years had been a test. They were testing the word, honing it, preparing it for the public. They had crafted an entire narrative of lies, a universe where they were the martyrs and I was the ungrateful, parasitic child. They weren't just ungrateful, they were actively, maliciously defaming me to our friends and family. They were taking my greatest gift to them, their financial freedom, and turning it into a story of their own suffering. The humiliation was a physical thing. I felt the eyes of the neighbors on me, filled with a pity I didn't deserve. I saw my father's smug satisfaction, my brother's lazy indifference, my mother's performance of victimhood. It all clicked into place. The strange anniversary party. The dismissive comments. The pointed looks. It was a stage, and I was the villain of the play, and I hadn't even known I was on trial. I grabbed my purse, my movements stiff. I walked out of the kitchen, through the dining room, and straight to the front door. I didn't say goodbye. I couldn't trust my voice. As I pulled the door shut behind me, I heard my mother's voice from the porch, rising in faux concern. "Is that Clara leaving already? She never stays for long." The drive back to my apartment was a blur. The city lights smeared across my windshield like wet paint. By the time I walked into my silent, empty home, the shock had begun to recede, and in its place, something cold and hard began to form. It was rage, pure and undiluted. But beneath the rage was the hum of my legal mind, already kicking into gear. My mother had made a critical error. She assumed I was just a daughter. She had forgotten that I was a lawyer, and I had just been handed the case of a lifetime. The defendant was my own family, and the charge was betrayal. I was going to find the truth, and then I was going to present them with the bill. For 2 full days, I was adrift in a sea of shock and fury. I called in sick to work, something I hadn't done in years, claiming a sudden migraine. The reality was that my mind was a chaotic storm of my mother's words, replaying on a loop, a freeloader, Carol. A professional one. The sheer audacity of the lie was staggering. It wasn't just a simple untruth, it was a meticulously constructed alternate reality. How could they lie so convincingly? And more importantly, why? The lawyer in me refused to let the questions fester. Emotion was a fog, but data was a lighthouse. I needed evidence. I needed to understand the scope of their deception before I could even think about what to do next. My first instinct was to confront them, to scream in rage and demand an explanation. But I quickly suppressed it. A confrontation without ammunition would be a disaster. They would deny everything, gaslight me, and paint me as hysterical and unstable. I'd seen it happen 1,000 times in court. The party with the most evidence wins. My starting point was the finances. For years, I had operated on a system of willful ignorance. I set up the automatic payments, transferred the monthly stipend, and paid any extra bills they sent me without question. I didn't want to be the kind of daughter who monitored her parents' spending. I wanted to give freely, without oversight. I now saw that this wasn't generosity, it was negligence. It had created a vacuum of accountability, and they had filled it with lies. I fired up my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard with a newfound, cold purpose. I had online access to the primary checking account from which the mortgage and utility bills were paid. It was a joint account, in both my name and my mother's, for the sake of convenience. I logged in, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. The transaction history was exactly as I expected, my monthly transfers coming in, and the mortgage, electricity, water, and cable payments going out. It was clean, straightforward, and completely transparent. But my mother's lie wasn't about these core expenses. She had spoken of a constant financial strain, of having to dip into savings to support me. That implied spending far beyond this basic budget. Where was that money going? I remembered the stipend. Every month, a significant sum was transferred from this joint account into a separate checking account that was solely in their names. I had set it up that way to give them privacy and autonomy over their daily spending on groceries, gas, and personal items. I had no access to that account. Or did I? I scanned through years of my old emails, searching for any correspondence with the bank. I found it, the original email chain from 3 years ago when I'd set up the accounts. Attached was the full PDF packet of the account agreements I had signed. Reading through the fine print, my legal training took over. I had co-signed as a guarantor on their checking account, not just the joint one. This was done at the time to ensure they would be approved without any issues, given my father's then recent job loss. As a guarantor, I didn't have direct access, but I had the right to request statements. My first call was to the bank's general customer service line. I was polite but firm, explaining my position as the financial guarantor and requesting the last 12 months of statements for their primary checking account. After a 20-minute hold and a transfer to a senior manager, my request was approved. They would be mailed to my address and should arrive in 5 to 7 business days. It was a start, but it felt too slow. I needed to know now. While I waited, I decided to look at the credit cards. I paid for one major credit card that was in my mother's name. She used it for larger purchases, and I settled the bill in full at the end of each month. I logged into that account. The spending was higher than I would have liked, but not astronomical. There were charges from department stores, expensive grocery stores, and several high-end restaurants. It was indulgent, but it didn't seem to align with the level of financial desperation she had portrayed. It showed a comfortable life, not a struggle. Then I saw something that made me pause. Among the familiar charges was a recurring monthly payment to something called Prestige Financial. I didn't recognize the name. It wasn't a utility, a store, or a subscription service I knew of. I Googled it. Prestige Financial was a credit card company, one specializing in high-limit, premium cards. They were paying off one credit card with another. Why? The question gnawed at me. I went back to the joint account, the one I could see clearly. I started scrolling through the transaction history again, this time going back further, not just looking at the big, obvious debits but at the small, repetitive ones. And then I found it. Tucked away among the utility bills was a tiny, automatic monthly payment of $24.99, labeled paperless statement fee ACCT hashtag ending in 8814. It wasn't for the account I was looking at. It was for a different account, at a different bank. An account I had no knowledge of. For years, I had been unknowingly paying the administrative fee on a secret bank account. My blood ran cold. This was it. This was the loose thread. Driven by a desperate hunch, I opened a new browser tab and went to the website of this other bank. On the login page, there was a forgot password link. I typed in my mother's email address and her name. The security question popped up, "What is the name of your first pet?" I knew the answer. It was a golden retriever named Rusty. I typed it in, my hands shaking. Access granted. I was in. My breath hitched. I was staring at a checking account I never knew existed. And it was almost empty. But the transaction history, it was a nightmare. There were weekly, sometimes daily, cash withdrawals from ATMs. Large payments to Prestige Financial, confirming my suspicion. And transfers. So many transfers to a single, recurring recipient, my brother, Jake Thompson. Thousands of dollars, month after month. But the most damning discovery was in the statements section. I clicked the link and a list of PDFs appeared. I opened the most recent one. It was a statement for a credit card from Prestige Financial, the one they were paying off. It was a joint card in the names of Mark and Susan Thompson. The balance made me feel physically ill. It was nearly $50,000. I scrolled through the pages of charges. It was a catalog of a life I couldn't even imagine. Luxury hotels in the city. A weekend trip to a wine country resort. Extravagantly expensive clothing from designer boutiques. Jewelry. Electronics. A down payment on a brand new sports car for my brother. They weren't just living comfortably, they were living like royalty, funding a secret, lavish lifestyle entirely on debt, all while I paid for their actual life, their home, their food, their utilities. And then, the final, brutal piece of the puzzle fell into place. The statement showed a large cash advance taken out 2 months prior. The date of that advance was 2 days before my mother had called me, complaining that her car needed new tires and asking if I could cover the unexpected expense. I had sent her the money without a second thought. The pieces were all there, scattered in front of me on the screen. The secret bank account. The hidden credit card. The monumental debt. The constant flow of money to my brother. The lies. They hadn't been dipping into their savings to support a freeloader daughter. They had been draining me dry to fund a fantasy, and they had created the lie to hide the evidence. Their story of victimhood wasn't just a way to garner sympathy, it was a preemptive strike, a carefully crafted alibi designed to deflect any suspicion if their house of cards ever came tumbling down. And I, the diligent, responsible lawyer, was about to become the demolition crew. Staring at the credit card statement, I felt a strange and unsettling calm descend upon me. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind the cold, clear certainty of a legal mind. This was no longer just a family drama, it was a complex case of financial fraud and deception. My parents weren't just ungrateful, they were conspirators. And my brother wasn't a harmless dreamer, he was a willing accomplice. I knew I couldn't navigate this alone. While I was an expert in corporate law, personal finance on this scale of deceit was a different beast. I needed someone with a meticulous eye for numbers, someone I could trust implicitly. I thought of my old friend from college, David Chen. We had gone through undergrad together before I went to law school and he went on to get his MBA. Now, he was a highly respected financial advisor with his own consulting firm. I picked up my phone and called him. Clara Vance. To what do I owe the pleasure? David's voice was warm and familiar. Don't tell me you're finally ready to let me manage that fat partner's salary. I wish it were that simple, Dave, I said, my voice flatter than I intended. I'm in a mess. A really big one. I need to hire you. The shift in his tone was immediate. I'm listening, he said. I spent the next hour laying out the whole sordid story, from the whispers at the dinner party to the hidden bank accounts and the shocking credit card debt. I forwarded him the statements I had downloaded, my hands trembling slightly as I hit send. He was silent for a long time after I finished, the only sound on the line being the faint clicks of his keyboard. Wow, he finally breathed. Clara, this is extensive. This isn't just bad spending, this is a systematic deception. Tell me about it, I muttered. They've been playing me for years. Okay, he said, his professional voice kicking in. Here's what we need to do. First, we need to understand the full scope of the liability. You found one card. I can almost guarantee there are others. Second, we need to trace where all the money went. You mentioned the sports car for your brother, we need to see how that was structured. Third, and this is the most critical part, we need to check the ownership and credit status of the house. That last point sent a chill down my spine. What do you mean? The house is in my name. The mortgage is solely mine. Are you sure? David asked gently. You said you set this up years ago. People can be added to titles. Lines of credit can be opened against a property's equity. Given what you've shown me, we can't assume anything is as it seems. He was right. The trust one had placed in my family was a shattered ruin. From now on, every single detail had to be verified. Over the next week, David and I worked with a quiet, furious efficiency. He initiated a comprehensive credit check on my parents using the information I, as their financial guarantor on one account, was legally entitled to obtain. The results came back faster than we expected, and they were breathtaking. It wasn't just the one prestige financial card with a $50,000 balance. There were 3 other high-interest credit cards, each with balances ranging from $10,000 to $15,000. There were also 2 personal loans from online lenders, the kind that offer quick cash at predatory interest rates. In total, my parents had amassed over $100,000 in unsecured debt, all while living rent-free in a house I paid for. The real bombshell, however, was the house. David's fears were horribly prescient. A year after I bought the property, my father had approached me with a stack of papers, explaining that for local tax and residency purposes, it would be simpler if his name was also on the deed. He had presented it as a bureaucratic formality. I was buried in a major case at the time, working around the clock. Distracted and trusting, I had signed the papers without giving them the scrutiny I would give any other legal document. I had made the catastrophic mistake of treating my family as if they were exempt from due diligence. The document wasn't just adding him to the deed. It was a quitclaim deed that had transferred partial ownership to him. And with that partial ownership, he had, 6 months ago, secured a home equity line of credit, HELOC, for $75,000 against the property. The bank had approved it based on the significant equity I had built in the home through my oversized mortgage payments. My blood turned to ice as I saw the transactions on the HELOC. The entire $75,000 had been drawn out. There were payments for a luxury vacation to Hawaii for my parents. A $20,000 wire transfer to my brother, Jake, which was likely the down payment for his sports car. The rest had been siphoned off in regular cash withdrawals. They had mortgaged my gift to them, turning my tribute into their personal slush fund. They had leveraged my hard work and my future to finance their lies. They committed fraud, Clara, David said, his voice grim as we sat in his office, the incriminating documents spread across his desk. They forged your signature or misrepresented what you were signing to get that HELOC. That's a crime. For a moment, the lawyer in me saw a clear path, prosecution. I could ruin them. But the thought of seeing my own parents in a courtroom, of being the instrument of their utter destruction, made me feel hollow. It wasn't about punishment in the eyes of the law. It was about justice in the context of our family. It was about reclaiming my life and my assets. The final piece of the puzzle was Jake. The money trail led directly to him, again and again. David did some digging and found that the sports car was leased, not owned, and Jake was already 2 months behind on the payments. The startup he was supposedly launching was nothing more than a flashy website with no product or business plan. He was living the high life in the city, hosting parties, and building a social media presence as a successful entrepreneur, all funded by the debt my parents had taken on in my name and against my property. He wasn't just an accomplice, he was the primary beneficiary of the entire scheme. We now had the complete picture. It was a web of breathtaking complexity and cruelty. My parents had cultivated the Clara is a freeloader narrative as a smokescreen. If any friends or relatives questioned their lavish spending, they could point to the supposed burden of their failure of a daughter as the reason for their financial struggles. It was a brilliant, sociopathic piece of social engineering. They had insulated themselves from suspicion by making me the scapegoat for a problem I was unknowingly funding. Sitting there in David's quiet, orderly office, surrounded by the evidence of my family's profound betrayal, I felt no sadness. The grief had been burned away by the sheer scale of the deception. All that was left was a cold, hard resolve. They had treated me like a line of credit, a faceless entity to be exploited. It was time to remind them that I was a person. More than that, I was a lawyer. And their account was now past due. The time for investigation was over. It was time to draft the plan. The drive back from David's office was different from the one after the dinner party. The frantic, wounded anger had been replaced by a chilling sense of clarity. The objective was no longer to understand, it was to act. My family had built a financial house of cards on a foundation of my money and my name. I was about to remove the foundation. For the next 48 hours, I barely slept. I converted my dining room table into a war room. With David on speakerphone, we worked through every single financial entanglement, every legal vulnerability, every possible move and countermove. This wasn't going to be an emotional outburst, it was going to be a surgical extraction. My legal training had prepared me for this kind of strategic thinking, but applying it to my own family felt surreal, as if I were dissecting my own life on an operating table. The plan had 3 phases: containment, notification, and execution. Phase 1, containment. The first step was to stop the bleeding. I had to cut off every single source of funding immediately and simultaneously, to prevent them from shuffling money around or taking on more debt once they realized what was happening. First, I logged into the joint bank account, the one I had full control over. I changed the password and security questions. Then, I set up a transaction to transfer the entire remaining balance to a new account at a different bank, an account solely in my name. I scheduled the transfer to go through at 9 a.m. on what I mentally began to call D-Day, Demolition Day. Next, the credit card I paid for my mother. I called the company, reported the card as compromised due to suspected financial abuse, and had it cancelled immediately. The outstanding balance was significant, but I paid it off in full. It was a bitter pill to swallow, paying for their luxuries, but it was the price of a clean break. The secret accounts were trickier. I couldn't legally close accounts that weren't in my name, but I could sever my connection to them. I drafted a formal, notarized letter to the bank where I was the guarantor on their checking account, revoking my guarantor status effective immediately. This would put the account under review and flag it for the bank's risk department. Then came the biggest problem, the home equity line of credit. The $75,000 they had stolen. David had a contact at the fraud department of the bank that issued the HELOC. I spent hours on the phone with an investigator, providing the documents David and I had gathered, including a sworn affidavit stating that I had been misled when signing the quitclaim deed and had no knowledge of the HELOC application. The bank launched an official internal investigation. This was a crucial step. It would freeze the HELOC, preventing further withdrawals, and it put the bank on notice that the debt was fraudulently obtained. It also meant the bank would be coming after my parents, not me. Phase 2, Notification. I couldn't just ghost them. The law, and my own conscience, required a formal notification process. This phase was all about documentation. I was building a case, not just for myself, but for any potential legal battles ahead. I spent an entire day creating what I called the dossier. It was a thick binder, meticulously organized with tabbed sections. Section 1 contained a complete financial breakdown, a spreadsheet detailing every dollar I had ever spent on them, from the down payment on the house to the last cable bill. The total was staggering, well over $500,000 in 3 years. Section 2 contained the evidence of their secret life, copies of the hidden bank and credit card statements, with the most egregious purchases highlighted in yellow. The Hawaiian vacation, the designer clothes, Jake's sports car lease agreement, it was all there. Section 3 was the legal section. It contained a copy of the quitclaim deed I had been tricked into signing. It also contained a formal notice of rescission, a legal document I drafted myself, declaring the deed void due to fraudulent inducement. And finally, the two most important documents, a formal demand letter for repayment of the $75,000 from the HELOC and a legal, 30-day eviction notice. The house was still legally half mine, and as co-owner, I had every right to evict tenants, which is what they had become, who were damaging the property's financial health. Every document was reviewed by David and then by a colleague of mine who specialized in real estate law. It had to be ironclad. There could be no loopholes, no ambiguity. Phase 3, Execution. This was the final and most difficult part of the plan. It required a face-to-face confrontation. I needed to deliver the dossier and the eviction notice in person. I needed to see their faces when the comfortable, lie-filled world they had built for themselves came crashing down. I scheduled D-Day for a Friday afternoon. I knew my mother would be home from the library, my father would be watching television, and my brother would likely be asleep. I wanted them all there. I wanted a captive audience. On the morning of D-Day, I woke up with a feeling of profound and terrifying calm. At 9 a.m. sharp, I executed the fund transfer, emptying the joint account. I then sent the notarized letters to the banks via certified mail. The containment phase was complete. The financial cords were cut. All that was left was to walk into that house, the house I had built for them, one last time. I dressed not as a daughter, but as a lawyer. I wore a charcoal gray suit, a crisp white blouse, and sensible heels. My hair was pulled back in a severe bun. I put the dossier and the legal notices into my leather briefcase. As I walked out of my apartment, I caught my reflection in the polished steel of the elevator doors. The woman staring back at me looked cold, distant, and formidable. She looked nothing like the girl who had desperately sought her parents' approval for 34 years. And for the first time, that felt like a victory. The drive to the suburbs felt different this time. It wasn't filled with dread or obligation, but with the grim focus of a soldier marching into battle. I parked my car across the street, not in the driveway. I needed the distance. For a moment, I just stared at the house. The perfect green lawn I paid a service to mow, the cheerful yellow flowers my mother had planted in the window boxes I'd installed, the welcoming red door that now felt like the gate to a hostile fortress. It was my house, but it had never been my home. I took a deep breath, grabbed my briefcase, and walked up the path. I didn't ring the bell. I used my own key, the cool metal a small reminder of my ownership. The lock clicked open with a definitive sound. I found them exactly where I expected them to be. My father was asleep in his recliner in the living room, a sports channel blaring on the enormous flat-screen TV I'd bought them for Christmas. My mother was at the kitchen table, working on a crossword puzzle. Jake's door was closed, but I could hear the faint thumping of a bass beat from inside. My mother looked up as I entered, her expression shifting from surprise to annoyance. "Clara. You could have called. You startled me." "We need to talk," I said, my voice even and devoid of emotion. "All of us. Wake up, Dad. Get Jake." Something in my tone must have alerted her that this was not a social call. Her brow furrowed. "Is everything all right? Did something happen?" "Everything is about to be set right," I replied. "Get them." She hesitated for a moment, then went and gently shook my father awake. He blinked groggily, his face etched with irritation. "What's going on?" he grumbled. My mother knocked on Jake's door. "Jake, honey, your sister's here. She needs to talk to us." He emerged a minute later, rubbing his eyes, looking petulant. "This better be important." I was working on a new track. Once they were all gathered in the living room, my father in his recliner, my mother and brother on the sofa, I walked to the large oak dining table that I had painstakingly chosen for their family gatherings. I opened my briefcase and took out the dossier, placing it on the polished wood with a soft but heavy thud. "What is this, Clara?" my father demanded. "Are you here to bore us with paperwork from your job?" "In a way," I said, not looking at him. I opened the binder. "This is an audit. A financial review of the arrangement we've had for the past 3 years. I thought it was time we all got on the same page regarding the numbers." I turned to the first page of the first section, the summary of my contributions. "This house," I began, my voice clear and steady, "was purchased by me for $650,000. The down payment was $130,000. The monthly mortgage payment, which I make, is $2,800. The property taxes, which I pay, are $12,000 a year. The utilities, insurance, and maintenance, also paid by me, average around $900 a month." I let the numbers hang in the air. Jake scoffed. "We get it, you make a lot of money. Do you want a medal?" I ignored him, turning the page. "In addition to maintaining the property, I have provided a monthly stipend of $3,000 for living expenses, totaling $108,000 over 3 years. I have also paid for miscellaneous expenses submitted to me, including car repairs, medical bills, and new appliances, totaling approximately $27,000. I looked up, meeting each of their eyes. "The grand total of my direct financial support to you over the last 36 months is $581,800. A stunned silence fell over the room. My mother's face was pale. My father's jaw was tight. "Now," I said, flipping to the next section. "Let's talk about your contributions." I laid out the bank statements from their secret account. I showed them the credit card bills with their tens of thousands of dollars in debt. I pointed to the highlighted charges, the resort in Hawaii, the designer handbags for my mother, the expensive golf clubs for my father. While I was providing you with a comfortable, debt-free existence, I said, my voice dropping to an icy calm, you were simultaneously accumulating over $100,000 in personal debt to fund a lifestyle of luxury. You told friends and family that you were struggling, that supporting me was a financial burden. My mother gasped, placing a hand over her heart. We never said that. That's a horrible lie. Is it? I asked, my gaze unwavering. I was in the hallway, Mom. At the dinner party. I heard you tell Aunt Carol and Mrs. Henderson that I was a freeloader. Your exact words. The color drained from her face. She looked cornered, her eyes darting towards my father for support, but he was staring at the statements, his face a thunderous shade of red. I saved the worst for last. I flipped to the final section and pulled out the HELOC agreement. And then there is this. A $75,000 line of credit you took out against this property. A property I paid for. A debt secured by an asset that you tricked me into giving you partial ownership of. My father finally erupted. That's a lie. We needed that money. For emergencies. Was Jake's sports car an emergency? I shot back, my voice like whipcrack. Was your trip to Hawaii an emergency? You didn't just take out a loan, you stole the equity from this house. My equity. I let the weight of it all settle in the room. The air was thick with their silent, panicked calculations. I saw the realization dawning on their faces that this wasn't just an argument. This was a prosecution. Finally, I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the last two documents. I slid the eviction notice across the table towards them. As co-owner of this property, which is now encumbered by a fraudulent debt you incurred, I am exercising my legal right. This is a 30-day notice to vacate the premises. My mother started to cry, soft, gulping sobs. Clara, you can't. This is our home. We have nowhere to go. You should have thought of that before you treated your daughter like an infinitely replenishing bank account and slandered her name to your friends, I said coldly. Jake jumped to his feet, his face twisted in rage. You can't do this. This is insane. After everything they've done for you. I laughed. A real, actual laugh, but it was a sound without humor. Done for me? I have paid for every single thing in this room. The roof over your head, the clothes on your back, the phone in your pocket. Your entire adult life has been one long, extended vacation paid for by me. The freeloading stops today. I placed the final document on the table, the demand letter for the $75,000. The bank has been notified of the fraudulent HELOC. Their investigation has already begun. They will be coming to you for repayment. I suggest you start selling your assets. I looked pointedly at my mother's expensive watch and my father's golf clubs. You have 30 days to find a new place to live. If you are not out by then, I will have you removed for trespassing. We are done here. I closed my briefcase, the clicks of the latches echoing in the silent room. I turned and walked towards the door, not looking back. The pleading started then, a desperate chorus of my name. Clara, wait. Please, we can talk about this. Don't do this to us. I didn't stop. I walked out the door, closing it firmly behind me on their ruined, fabricated world. As I walked down the path, I felt no triumph, no joy. Just the profound, quiet, and earth-shattering relief of being free. The 30 days that followed were a strange mixture of deafening silence and distant, frantic noise. I blocked their numbers, but the voicemails still came through, a predictable and pathetic cycle of rage, then threats, then tearful pleading. I listened to none of them, deleting them as soon as the notification appeared. David handled all communication with the banks, and my real estate lawyer handled all communication from a desperate, low-budget attorney my parents had hired in a futile attempt to fight the eviction. They had no case, and they knew it. The evidence in the dossier was irrefutable. Extended family members started calling. Aunt Carol called, sputtering apologies, claiming my mother had misrepresented the situation. I accepted her apology coolly but kept my distance. Others were less understanding, accusing me of being cruel and heartless for throwing my own family out onto the street. To each of them, I emailed a single, password-protected PDF, a condensed, 2-page summary of the financial facts, showing the money I had provided versus the debt they had hidden. The calls stopped. The truth, it turned out, was a very effective silencer. On the 30th day, a moving truck, a small one, not the large professional kind I had hired to move them in, appeared at the house. I watched from my car, parked down the street again, as my parents and brother loaded their now meager belongings into the back. They looked smaller, diminished, stripped of the arrogance that my money had bought them. The expensive furniture I had purchased was being left behind, as it was legally part of the property. They were taking only their clothes, their personal effects, and the weight of their choices. I saw my father arguing with Jake, his gestures angry and defeated. I saw my mother wipe a tear from her eye as she took one last look at her garden. I felt a pang of something, not pity, but a deep, sorrowful ache for the family we could have been. Then I started my car and drove away before they could see me. The first few weeks of their absence were liberating. I hired a cleaning crew to purge the house of their presence, to scrub it clean of the lies and resentment. Then I put it on the market. It sold in less than a month for a significant profit, even after settling the fraudulent HELOC with the bank to clear the title. The remaining money went into a trust fund for my future, a future that was now entirely my own. The silence was the best part. No more Sunday calls filled with passive aggression. No more unexpected bills appearing in my inbox. No more feeling like an ATM. I started leaving work at a reasonable hour. I reconnected with old friends. I took a vacation, a real one, to Italy, where I spent 2 weeks eating pasta, drinking wine, and not thinking about my family once. I was reclaiming my life, one peaceful day at a time. About 6 months after the eviction, I received a letter. It was an actual, handwritten letter, on cheap stationery, from my mother. My first instinct was to throw it away. But curiosity got the better of me. I opened it, my hand steady. The letter was short and awkward. It was full of justifications and excuses about how they felt left behind by my success and how they were under a lot of pressure. But buried beneath the self-pity were 3 words I never thought I would read: we were wrong. She wrote that my father was now working part-time as a cashier at a hardware store. Jake had finally gotten a job as a busboy at a restaurant. They were living in a small, 2-bedroom apartment an hour outside the city. It was, she wrote, a humbling experience. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just asked if, one day, I might be willing to have a cup of coffee with her. I read the letter several times. The old Clara would have jumped at the chance, desperate for any crumb of reconciliation. But I wasn't the old Clara anymore. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer. I didn't know if I would ever be ready for that cup of coffee. The wounds were too deep, the betrayal too profound. Forgiveness felt like a distant country I wasn't yet ready to visit. But as I looked out my apartment window at the sprawling city lights, I realized that the outcome of this story wasn't about them anymore. It wasn't about revenge or even about justice. It was about my own liberation. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their love, believing it was something I had to purchase. Now I knew the truth: real love is never for sale. And the freedom that comes from learning that lesson? That is priceless. I had finally stopped paying for their life, and in doing so, I had finally started living my own.